What if the flood wasn't punishment, but deletion? Enoch said God erased a civilization so advanced, its memory itself was dangerous. What did they build that heaven couldn't allow to survive? Long before Noah ever touched a hammer to a plank of wood, the earth was not empty. It was not primitive. It was not a scattering of a few wandering families waiting for history to begin. According to the Book of Enoch, the world before the flood was crowded, advanced, and dangerously alive, with knowledge that did not belong to human hands. Genesis gives us only a whisper of this, a single strange line about sons of God, who saw the daughters of men and took wives for themselves, and from that union came the Nephilim, giants, mighty men of old, men of renown. But Enoch does not whisper. Enoch names names. He tells us of 200 watchers, angelic beings bound by oath on the summit of Mount Hermon, who descended not to observe humanity, but to change it. Their leader, Semjaza, feared to act alone, so he bound his companions together in a pact, a conspiracy against heaven itself, sealed by an oath none of them could later break. What followed was not a single sin, but a flood of them, an entire civilization built on borrowed fire. Azazel taught men to forge swords, shields, and breastplates, turning tribes into armies, where before there had only been families. Others revealed the secrets of the stars, the movements of the moon, the working of metals, the cutting of roots, the casting of spells. Barakijal taught astrology, Kokabel revealed the constellations, Ezekiel opened up the knowledge of the clouds. Each watcher, Enoch tells us by name, became a professor of something humanity was never meant to learn this early, and none of them taught with any warning label attached. Women were taught the art of adornment, of painting the face, of drawing the eye of men who were no longer only men. This was not simply forbidden knowledge. It was knowledge given before its time, poured into a species that had not yet learned to hold it without breaking. The way a child is handed a blade before ever being taught what it costs to swing one. And humanity broke. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were not ordinary children. Enoch describes them as giants of enormous size, creatures whose appetite could not be satisfied by the harvest of the land. When the fields failed to feed them, they turned on the animals. When the animals were gone, they turned on each other and finally on mankind itself. The text says they drank the blood of what they consumed, a detail so unsettling that later Jewish and Christian writers could barely bring themselves to repeat it. This was a world where violence was not the exception, but the atmosphere everyone breathed. Genesis 6 confirms the verdict in 9 devastating words. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. This is where the deeper question begins to surface, the one most sermons never touch. Why would God allow such advancement in the first place, only to erase it completely? Enoch's answer is uncomfortable because it does not blame ignorance, it blames a shortcut. The Watchers gave humanity power without wisdom, technology without restraint, secrets without the moral architecture to carry them safely. Baalbek stones cut and lifted with a precision modern engineers still cannot fully explain, sit in Lebanon, as if daring us to ask who built them and how. One block alone, still resting in the quarry nearby, weighs more than a fully loaded jumbo jet, and no crane on Earth today would lift it without months of preparation. Göbekli Tepe, buried deliberately by the very people who raised it, predates what we were taught was the dawn of civilization by thousands of years, its pillars carved with animals and symbols by hands that supposedly had not yet invented the wheel or writing. These places do not prove Enoch's account, but they refuse to let us dismiss it either. Something was here. Something was capable, and something deliberately was buried on purpose, not lost to time, but hidden from it. Enoch writes that the cry of the earth reached heaven, not a metaphor but a courtroom scene. The souls of the murdered called out, and their voices did not go unheard. God did not simply grow angry and lash out. He convened judgment. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel are each given a task in Enoch's account, and Uriel is sent to warn Noah specifically of what is coming, so that a remnant might survive what was about to be undone. This detail matters more than it first appears, because it changes the entire shape of the story. The flood was not chaos, unleashed in a moment of divine rage. It was surgery, planned and precise. A civilization had grown a tumor of violence and forbidden power so advanced that it threatened to metastasize into something no human generation could recover from, and heaven chose to remove it before it could spread further than it already had. Jude in the New Testament looks back on this same account and calls the Watchers angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode. He places them in chains, in darkness, reserved for judgment. Peter's second epistle echoes it, speaking of God not sparing the angels who sinned. These are not obscure footnotes. They are canonical writers treating Enoch's world as real history, a history so serious that it shaped how the earliest church understood sin, judgment, and mercy long before later councils quietly pushed the book itself to the margins. None of this was hidden from the writers who came after. It was simply hidden from us, by centuries of councils deciding which memories the church was allowed to keep. If this is the first time you're hearing the fuller account, not the Sunday school version, but the one Enoch actually wrote, you are standing at the edge of a story most people never get to see whole. We put together an illustrated guide called The Forbidden Book of Enoch, walking through the Watchers, the giants, and exactly what vanished beneath the water, page by page, image by image, so you can hold this history in your hands instead of piecing it together from memory. The link is waiting in the very first comment pinned to this video, and it was built for exactly the kind of mind that just watched this far. Before we go further into what this vanished world actually built and why God judged its knowledge more severely than its violence, take a moment to subscribe. There is a great deal more of this history waiting, and it only reaches you if you're already part of the channel when it arrives. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, gives us something Genesis never bothers to show: what it actually felt like to live inside that world as it started to rot from within. Two of the giants, Hobabish and Ohia, sons of the Watcher Shemihaza, are shown having nightmares. Real, documented, terrifying dreams. In one, a garden of trees is uprooted by fire. In another, the earth itself is described as sinking beneath the weight of what stands on it. These are not the dreams of monsters comfortable in their power. These are the dreams of beings who somehow sensed, even before the rain started, that they had built something too heavy for the world to carry. The giants send their own dream to Enoch to be interpreted, because even they understood he was the only man left who still spoke the language of heaven. It is a strange detail to sit with, that the very creatures responsible for the earth's corruption were the ones most afraid of what was coming, more afraid perhaps than the humans who had far less power to lose. Genesis 6 tells us these Nephilim were mighty men, men of renown, a phrase that sounds almost like admiration until you notice the sentence right after it. Their fame did not save them, it condemned them. Fame, in this account, is not the same as favor. Jubilees, an ancient text treasured by the community at Qumran and still canonical in the Ethiopian church today, adds a detail Genesis skips entirely, that the giants began warring against one another before the flood ever arrived, tribe against tribe, brother against brother, until the earth was already tearing itself apart from the inside. God did not need to introduce violence into that world. He only had to stop protecting it from the violence it had already chosen. What makes this story unsettling instead of simply mythological is how specific the ancient writers get about scale. Josephus, writing centuries later as a Jewish historian working under Roman patronage, records that the bones of these giants were still being unearthed in his own lifetime, remained so large that people who found them didn't know what species they belonged to. The Genesis Apocryphon, another scroll from the same Qumran caves, shows us Lamech, Noah's own father, staring at his newborn son and doubting whether the child is even human. The baby's skin is described as white as snow, his eyes like the rays of the sun, and Lamech runs to his father Methuselah in a panic, certain that a watcher has fathered the boy instead of him. Methuselah has to travel to Enoch himself at the edges of the earth just to get an answer. That is how deep the corruption of bloodlines had gone. A father could no longer trust his own child's face, and a grandfather had to consult an angel-walking prophet just to confirm that his own grandson belonged to the human family at all. This is the world Noah was born into and asked to survive. Not a world of primitive tribes scratching soil with sticks, but a world sophisticated enough to forge metal. chart stars, wage organized war, and question the very boundary between human and something else. The flood did not fall on ignorance. It fell on a civilization that had learned too much, too fast, from teachers who had no right to be teaching at all. And the story does not end at the shoreline of the Middle East. Flood traditions appear on nearly every inhabited continent, told by cultures that had no recorded contact with one another. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu account of Manu, Mesoamerican legends of a great deluge, and Andean memory carried in stone at sites like Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, cities built with interlocking blocks so precise that modern masons still study how they were cut. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, divers have mapped stepstone formations resting on the seafloor, structures that look unmistakably deliberate, even though no one agrees on who made them or when. None of this proves Enoch's account word for word, but it does something almost as powerful. It suggests that the memory of a world drowned on purpose was not invented by one tribe in one desert. It was carried independently by people scattered across the entire planet, as if the flood left the same bruise on every branch of the human family. Enoch's own position in heaven's court makes this global memory feel less like coincidence. He was not simply told about the judgment, he was sent physically to deliver it to the watchers themselves. Enoch describes climbing through the layers of the heavens, past walls of fire and crystal, into a throne room where the presence of God was too bright to be described in ordinary language. There, he was given the verdict and told to carry it back down to the very beings who had started this catastrophe, Semjaza and Azazel among them. Imagine being handed that assignment, not preaching to strangers, but standing before the architects of your world's collapse and telling them, to their faces, that mercy had already run out. Enoch pleaded on their behalf once. He was refused, sent back down the same path he had climbed, with an answer that offered no room for negotiation. The oath they swore on Hermon had already sealed what came next, and no amount of pleading from a mortal, even one who walked with God, could undo a corruption that had spread this far into the bones of the earth itself. What strikes hardest about this section of Enoch's account is not the size of the giants or the strangeness of Lamech's fear, it's the loneliness of it. Noah is never described as gathering allies. He is described as walking with God in a generation where almost no one else was. Every other family in Genesis simply vanishes from the record, absorbed into a corruption too total to survive, while one man kept building something the rest of the world had stopped believing was even necessary, a way back to the ground floor of creation, stripped of everything that had gone wrong. He was not praised for it in his own lifetime. He was almost certainly mocked for it, hammering planks together under a clear sky, while an entire civilization that could cut stone, forge weapons, and chart the stars walked past him and saw nothing but an old man wasting his years on a boat that would never touch water. Strip away the giants and the war for a moment, because the real reason this world had to vanish sits somewhere quieter, somewhere most people scroll right past without noticing. It was not simply that the Watchers gave humanity swords, it was that they gave humanity worship pointed in the wrong direction. Azazel is not remembered in Enoch's account only as a weapons instructor. He becomes, over the following centuries of Jewish tradition, almost synonymous with the wilderness itself, the figure onto whom sin is symbolically loaded and sent away on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. A being tied to forbidden knowledge in one book becomes, generations later, the very embodiment of what needs to be cast out of the camp entirely. That is not a coincidence buried in dusty scrolls. That is a civilization's memory of exactly what went wrong, encoded into ritual so it would never be forgotten, even after the book that first named him was pushed to the margins of scripture by councils centuries later who preferred their history tidier than Enoch was willing to make it. The Sibylline Oracles, a strange and sprawling collection of prophetic writings from the ancient Mediterranean world, describe this pre-flood era in language that sounds almost apocalyptic in reverse, a golden age curdling into something monstrous because knowledge arrived faster than character could catch up to it. Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an Aramaic paraphrase of the Torah used in ancient synagogues, goes further than Genesis ever does in its plain text, naming the fallen ones Shammazai and Azael directly, unfolding their story into the official memory of the nation, not as legend but as explanation. Why did the world need drowning? Because a shortcut had been taken around the slow, difficult work of becoming wise, and the shortcut had a price nobody had been warned about until it was already being paid. The Book of Jasher, referenced twice in the Hebrew Bible itself, once in Joshua and once in 2 Samuel, adds a layer that feels almost uncomfortably modern. It describes a world before the flood, not just violent, but organized in its corruption, with rulers and judges who accepted bribes, perverted justice and openly celebrated wrongdoing rather than hiding it. This was not chaos in the sense of anarchy. It was chaos in the sense of a functioning system built entirely on the wrong foundation. Laws and courts and leadership structures all pointed toward appetite instead of righteousness. A civilization does not need to collapse into savagery to become unsalvageable. Sometimes it only needs to become extremely efficient at doing the wrong thing, polishing its cruelty until it looks, from the inside, almost respectable. This is where Ephesians becomes an unexpected companion to Enoch, rather than a contradiction of it. Paul writes that believers do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Read that line after spending time with the Watchers on Hermon, and it stops sounding like poetic exaggeration. It starts sounding like an ongoing report from the same battlefield Enoch first described, one that never actually closed when the flood receded, only changed its methods and learned to work quietly instead of openly. Daniel later encounters something similar when a heavenly messenger tells him his prayer was heard the moment he prayed it, but the answer was delayed 3 weeks because of resistance from the Prince of the Kingdom of Persia, a spiritual power operating behind the human throne, invisible to everyone in that court, except the one man who had learned to see past it. The world Enoch describes did not end at the waterline. It went underground, and it kept working. Matthew 24 gives this whole account its sharpest edge, because Jesus himself reaches back into this exact period when describing the last days. As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. People were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, completely unaware, right up until the flood came and took them all away. That single sentence does something remarkable. It takes what could be dismissed as ancient mythology and places it inside the mouth of Christ as a working model for the future, a pattern that repeats rather than a one-time historical curiosity. If the days of Noah are the template, then understanding exactly what those days contained is not simply satisfying curiosity about the past, it is reading the manual for what is still coming. Megalithic sites keep surfacing in this conversation for a reason, and Sacsayhuaman, the fortress complex above Cusco in Peru, belongs in the same breath as Baalbek and Göbekli Tepe. Its walls are built from stones weighing well over 100 tons each, interlocked without mortar so precisely that even a knife blade cannot slide between them, shaped to survive earthquakes that have leveled colonial buildings around them for centuries, while the ancient walls themselves stand untouched. Local memory attributes construction to giants or to a race of builders who came before the Inca themselves, a detail that lines up strangely well with a global pattern of before civilizations remembered as larger, stronger, and eventually removed. No single stone proves what Enoch wrote, but taken together, across continents that had no contact with one another, this pattern of advanced building followed by deliberate burial or abandonment starts to look less like coincidence and more like an echo, the aftershock of something the whole species once witnessed, and then generation by generation tried to forget. The way a family stops mentioning a relative's name after something terrible happens, not because they forgot, but because remembering costs too much. What makes Enoch's version so different from a simple morality tale is that it refuses to let humanity off the hook by blaming outside forces entirely. Yes, the Watchers initiated the corruption, but humanity received it eagerly, weaponized it quickly, and built entire economies and armies around it within a handful of generations. The judgment that followed was not aimed at angels alone. It was aimed at a partnership, a willing collaboration between fallen beings and human ambition that neither side seemed interested in stopping once it began producing results. Men did not resist the gifts of the Watchers. They organized their entire societies around them, built armies, economies, and belief systems on top of them, and handed them down to their children as inheritance rather than warning. That is the uncomfortable center of this entire account, and it is the part most retellings quietly leave out. When the water finally came, Enoch's account makes clear it was not aimed at the whole created order out of spite. It was aimed at removing a specific corruption before it could spread any further than it already had, root and branch, so thoroughly that even memory would struggle to reconstruct what had been lost. The Watchers themselves were bound, not killed outright. Enoch describes them being cast into darkness, chained beneath the hills of the earth, held for a judgment still to come rather than executed on the spot. Jude confirms this directly, writing that these angels who abandoned their proper domain are kept in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Peter's second letter says almost the same thing, describing God casting the sinning angels into chains of gloomy darkness to be reserved for judgment. Two apostles, writing generations apart to different audiences, landed on the same image Enoch had already recorded centuries earlier. That kind of agreement across such distance is not easy to explain away as coincidence, and it suggests the early church treated Enoch's account not as fringe speculation, but as shared, reliable memory passed down through the same stream of tradition that eventually produced Genesis itself. But here is the detail most retellings skip entirely, and it may be the most unsettling piece of the whole account. The giants themselves, the physical offspring of Watchers and human women, were destroyed in the flood along with everyone else. Their bodies died. Their spirits, according to Jubilees and later Enochic tradition, did not simply vanish along with them. Jubilees describes these spirits becoming a new category of being altogether, roaming the earth without bodies, corrupting, misleading, and afflicting the descendants of Noah in the centuries that followed, a haunting that the survivors of the flood inherited without ever having chosen it themselves. This is where the ancient world's understanding of demons actually originates, not as an abstract theological concept invented later, but as the direct spiritual residue of a civilization that God had judged but could not fully erase from the world's memory. The flood cleaned the surface. It did not clean everything underneath it, and later Jewish and Christian writers alike carried that understanding forward, treating unclean spirits not as a vague metaphor, but as an inheritance left behind by exactly this catastrophe. This explains something that otherwise reads like an embarrassing contradiction in Scripture. If the giants were wiped out in the flood, why does Numbers describe the 12 spies returning from Canaan terrified, reporting that they saw the Nephilim there and that they felt like grasshoppers next to them? Why does Deuteronomy spend so much careful attention naming the Rephaim, the Emim, the Anakim, entire peoples of unusual size scattered through the land Israel was about to enter, describing Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed alone measured over 13 feet long, a detail so specific it reads less like folklore and more like an official record, someone felt necessary to preserve for skeptical readers centuries later. Genesis 6 itself contains the clue, almost buried in plain sight. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Not only before the flood, after it as well. Whatever mechanism produced the first generation of Nephilim did not end with Noah's flood. It resumed on a smaller scale in the centuries that followed, which may explain why the conquest of Canaan carried a weight far heavier than simple territorial war. It was, in some very real sense, a continuation of the same conflict that had required the flood in the first place, fought this time not with water, but with an army carrying instructions written on stone tablets instead of a boat. Noah's own position through all of this deserves more attention than it usually gets. 2 Peter calls him a preacher of righteousness, a phrase Genesis never explicitly uses, suggesting an oral tradition that remembered Noah not merely as a builder following instructions, but as a man actively warning his generation while he worked, year after year, likely for decades, with almost nobody listening. 1 Peter adds one of the strangest lines in the entire New Testament, describing Christ preaching to the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, a passage that has puzzled readers for 2,000 years, precisely because it assumes its audience already knew exactly which spirits were being discussed. Scholars have argued over exactly what this means for centuries, but read alongside Enoch, it fits with startling precision. The imprisoned spirits are the watchers, bound since the flood, and even in that captivity, still somehow within reach of a message that mattered. Proof that the story Enoch began did not simply end with judgment but stretched forward into the very ministry of Christ himself. What strikes me most about this stretch of the story is the sheer patience God shows before finally acting. Enoch does not describe an impulsive deity striking out in a fit of anger. He describes centuries of tolerance, watching a civilization dig itself deeper into a hole it refused to climb out of before judgment finally arrived. And even then, judgment came with an escape hatch built directly into it. Noah was not simply spared. He was warned in advance, given the exact blueprint for survival, and told to build it himself plank by plank in full view of neighbors who apparently never once believed the warning was real. That is not the behavior of a God eager to destroy. That is the behavior of a God who exhausted every alternative first, who waited generation after generation for even a single household to turn back, and found only one. There is also something worth sitting with in how small the surviving remnant actually was. 8 people, out of what Enoch and the archaeological record together suggest may have been a sprawling, technologically capable, densely populated civilization. Only 8 walked off that ark when the water finally receded. That ratio alone tells you how total the judgment was, and how narrow the path through it had become, narrower than almost anyone in that generation could have imagined possible, right up until the moment the door of the ark was sealed shut from the outside. It also tells you something about what God considers worth preserving when everything else has to go. Not power, not technology, not fame. A man who kept building and kept warning, long after everyone around him had stopped listening. And a family willing to trust a promise that made no visible sense until the rain actually started to fall. For centuries, most Christians in the West never read a word of this account directly. The Book of Enoch simply was not there. It vanished from Western Bibles somewhere in the long process of canon formation, referenced by Jude, quoted almost verbatim in places, clearly known and respected by the earliest church fathers, and yet ultimately left outside the official collection that most translations now carry. Tertullian, one of the earliest Christian theologians, defended Enoch's authenticity directly, arguing that Noah himself would have preserved his great-grandfather's writings through the flood specifically because they mattered. Origen quoted from it, and Clement of Alexandria treated its account of the Watchers as settled background knowledge rather than a fringe theory needing defense. Even so, by the time later councils were finalizing what belonged in Scripture, Enoch was set aside, not necessarily because anyone proved it false, but because its content made certain conversations too uncomfortable to keep having in an increasingly formalized institutional church. There is one place, though, where this book never disappeared. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the entire text of Enoch continuously, treating it as fully canonical to this day, reading it alongside the rest of Scripture without the centuries-long gap that Western Christianity experienced. For a long time, this felt to outside scholars like a regional curiosity, a text surviving on the margins of the Christian world with little bearing on mainstream biblical study, kept alive more by devotion than by academic attention. Then, in 1947, shepherds searching for a lost goat near the Dead Sea stumbled into caves at Qumran, and everything shifted. Among the scrolls recovered there were fragments of Enoch itself, written in Aramaic, dated by scholars to centuries before Christ. This was not a late invention dressed up as ancient prophecy. It was already old when Jesus walked the earth, already circulating among devout Jewish communities who treated it with enough seriousness to copy, preserve, and hide in clay jars for 2,000 years, waiting in a strange way for exactly this moment to be found again by people who had almost entirely forgotten it existed. What makes this discovery matter beyond mere academic interest is what it does to the credibility of everything Enoch describes. This was not a fringe text invented to entertain. It was read, copied, and clearly valued by the same communities that gave the world the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts now recognized as some of the most important religious archaeological finds in human history, studied by scholars who take their contents far more seriously than casual dismissal would suggest. Jude's decision to quote Enoch directly in the New Testament suddenly looks less like an odd choice and more like the natural move of a writer drawing on a text his audience would have immediately recognized and respected, the same way a modern preacher might quote a well-known hymn without needing to explain where it came from or defend its right to be in the room. The deeper question this account leaves us with is not really about giants or ancient stone, or even about angels at all. It is about the pattern itself, the shape of the danger, and whether that shape has actually gone anywhere. The Watchers offered humanity power without character, knowledge without wisdom, capability stripped of any moral framework capable of containing it. That is not a uniquely ancient temptation. It is arguably the defining temptation of every generation since, dressed in whatever technology happens to be available at the time. Every civilization that has ever collapsed under its own weight has followed some version of the same arc, astonishing capability arriving faster than the character required to steward it responsibly. Enoch's own fate stands in sharp, deliberate contrast to everything that followed him. Genesis says simply that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death is recorded, no burial. He is one of only two figures in the entire Hebrew Bible, alongside Elijah centuries later, who leaves the earth without passing through the grave at all. In a book otherwise consumed with judgment, corruption, and the slow collapse of an entire civilization, Enoch himself becomes the proof that a different path was always available. He lived in the same world as the Watchers. He watched the same forbidden knowledge spread through the same generation that would eventually drown for it. And instead of being swept into that current, he was lifted directly out of it, walking so closely with God that death itself apparently had no claim on him, a quiet ending that says more about what actually pleases heaven than any of the judgment that surrounds it. This is where the account stops being simply a story about the ancient past and starts asking something of whoever is still listening. If Enoch is right about what happened before the flood, then the flood was never really the point. The point was the choice that preceded it, repeated by every single person in that generation, except for one family willing to build something the rest of the world thought was unnecessary. The knowledge the Watchers offered was not inherently useless or without power. Much of it, stripped of its context, describes real things: metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, agriculture, the same fields of study that still fill university curriculums today, without anyone questioning their value on the surface. The danger was never the knowledge itself. It was receiving that knowledge severed from any relationship with the one who created the world it was meant to operate inside of. Power without that anchor does not stay neutral for long. It curdles generation by generation until it produces exactly the kind of world Enoch describes standing in ruins beneath the flood. That tension has never actually left human history. It has simply changed its vocabulary, trading swords and spells for whatever the current century happens to call progress, whether that progress arrives through a laboratory, a factory, or a screen glowing quietly in the dark of someone's living room. The question Enoch's account leaves hanging over every generation that reads it is not whether new knowledge will keep arriving, because it always does. The question is whether it will arrive the same way it did on Hermon, disconnected and unaccountable, handed down by teachers with no stake in the well-being of the ones receiving it, or whether it will be received the way Enoch himself seemed to carry it, walking so closely with the source of all wisdom that even the most dangerous discoveries never had the chance to curdle into something the earth eventually could not hold. That is the civilization God chose to bury, and that is the warning Enoch carried out of it. If this account moved something in you, our illustrated guide, the Forbidden Book of Enoch, walks through every piece of it in far greater depth, with imagery that brings the Watchers, the giants, and the world before the flood to life on the page. You'll find the link waiting in the first comment pinned below. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. If it stirred something in you, subscribe to the channel, drop a comment telling me which part struck you hardest, and give this video a like before you go. More of this hidden history is waiting right on your screen. Stay a little longer.